Shavua Tov. It is not Sunday, but I am recording the daf for Sunday, which is Masechet Zevachim, daf Mem Tet. Sunday's daf, because I will be traveling. And I'm in an airport lounge, so hopefully it will go well. I'm going to start, and hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to start from the bottom of daf Mem Chet Amud Bet, sugya, which of course we will get to, God willing, on Motzei Shabbat. And I'm going to start from two lines from the bottom. So Ravada Barava asked a question, which will make sense, of course, in the right time, which is that how can you say, well, basically, we wanted to say a kal v'chomer. We're trying to prove that shchita in the north is ma'akev, meaning if you don't do it, it's pasul. And we tried to prove that it's true about a chatat from an ola from a kal v'chomer. Okay. Says the Gemara, Amar Ravina. Now, we didn't understand the question yesterday, but says the Gemara today, two lines from the bottom of Memched Amud Bet. Amar Ravina, Ha kashle the Ravada bar Abba. You know what Ravada bar Abba's question was about this Kal v'chomer? Was that Klum matzinu tafel chomer min ha'ikar. Where do you ever find that a secondary thing, a tafel, meaning a secondary thing, is more chomer than the primary thing? Meaning, in this case, we're talking about a chatat, which is learned out from an ola. If the ola is the source, that's the ikar, and the chatat is learned from the ola, that's the tafel, how could it be that a chatat is more strict in halacha, meaning it's ma'akev, than an ola? And that was the question of Rav Bar Ava. Says Mar Zutra, Breder of Mari Ravina, but that's not a question at all. Velo, you never find such a thing. We're about to now bring several examples where one thing is derived from another thing. So the second thing is the tafel, and the primary thing is less strict than the secondary thing. And what's the first example? Maaser sheni. Maaser sheni, right? You have maaser sheni, right? Remember, every year you have plants, you grow, you take the second maaser, you have to bring it to Yerushalayim. Torah very clearly says, if you can't make it to Yerushalayim, you can be podeh the maaser sheni, take money, the money becomes kodesh, and use the money in Yerushalayim. However, lakuach bekesef maaser, right? If you then, once you're in Yerushalayim, you buy something with that maaser, you can never then redeem that thing. Eino niftet, right? So it's stricter, meaning the maaser is not so strict. You can be podeh. The second order thing, what was bought with the maaser, you can be podeh. I'm sorry, you can't be podeh, making it's stricter. The kedusha never leaves it. It's not, and that's based on a Mishnah in Masechet Maaser Sheni, which says the following: Halakuach bekesef Maaser Shenitzma. You buy something with a kesef, a Maaser Sheni, right? So again, you have Maaser Sheni, which are fruits. You exchange those fruits for money. Take the money up to Yerushalayim. You buy a sandwich, right? Then that sandwich becomes tamei. Says the Mishnah, you put that, so redeem it. You can't eat tamei Maaser Sheni, but you can exchange the kedusha from the Maaser Sheni onto money and then use that money to buy other Maaser Sheni. But Rabbi Yehuda says yikaver. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. And Rabbi Yehuda says you can never redeem something that was bought with Maaser Sheni. So here you see an example of something that is a second order thing. It's not the Maaser Sheni itself. It was what was bought with Maaser Sheni, and it has a stronger kedusha than the first Maaser Sheni. Says, well, that's not because it's stronger. It's because hatam there, fourth line from the top, lo alima kedusha telim tfas pidyona. The problem is that the kedusha is not strong enough to make it a pidyon, meaning in order for something to be exchanged from Maaser Sheni, it has to be of strong kedusha, and then you say, I take the Maaser Sheni and I put it on this money, and the kedusha flies to the money. But if the thing of Maaser Sheni is a second order Maaser Sheni, meaning it was bought with Maaser Sheni, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not strong enough that the kedusha can move on to the money. And if the kedusha can't move on to the money, it didn't go anywhere, and therefore you can never redeem it. So it's not because it's stronger. In fact, it's because it's weaker. Says, okay, what about Tamura? Right? Tamura is the classic case where you take an animal that's kachim and you take a second animal, put it next to it, and say, I want this second animal to be in place of the first animal, which you're not allowed to do. But if you say that, the kedusha is in both animals. The first one, which was kachim, and the second one becomes a Tamura. But obviously, that second one then is a second order. But there, ilo kachim lo chayla balmum kavua. If I go take an animal that has a balmum that's a kavua balmum, meaning it's a permanent wound, and I say I want this animal to be kodesh, it does not become kodesh kedushat haguf because it can't be brought as a carbon, right? But ilo ihu chayla, but tamura would be chal on an animal that is a mum, right? Because we're gonna see this in Masechet Tamura, but the halacha of tamura applies universally. So if you take an animal with a mum and you say I want this to be in place of the other animal, it becomes kodesh. However, if you took a primary animal and said that, it wouldn't become kodesh. That's very different too, because Tamura Mikwach Kachim Ka'atya, right? The Kedusha of the second animal of Tamura is because you're transferring the Kachim. So that's a very powerful thing, and it can happen even on a Balmum. When you take an animal that's chulin and you say, I want to make this into a carbon, you basically need to have more power there because you have to convert a chulin animal into a kachim animal, right? And the koach comes from chulin. So therefore, if it is balmum, you can't do that. But by tamura, because you're transferring from a carbon already, that's easier to do. And that's why tamura would be chal even on an animal to balmum. So that's not a question. What about Pesach? What about Pesach? Carbon Pesach. Remember, a carbon Pesach is a special carbon. We're going to learn a lot, and we've discussed. Because a carbon Pesach, although it's like a shlamim, Eino ta'un, a lot of the halachot of a shlamim. It doesn't need smicha. You don't have to lean on it. It doesn't need the sachim. You don't have to bring the wine along with it. It doesn't need tnufat chazev v'shok. You don't have to wave the big, place of the animal. So none of those things are necessary for a carbon Pesach. But motardi day, remember, if you take a korban pesach and you don't bring it, you separate an animal for a korban pesach, pesach passes, that animal becomes a shlamim. But when that motardi day means the leftover of a pesach, but the leftover of a pesach, which we think is secondary, it does need smicha, nesachim, tnufat chasav v'shok. You have to do all these things for it. So you see, the primary animal, the korban pesach, didn't need all these things. The secondary animal, which is the leftover pesach, needs all these things. So you see that sometimes the second thing, the tafel, is more chamer than the ikar. Answers the Gemara, that's also not a good proof because Pesach, Bishar Yemot Hashana Shlamimhu. The reason that a Pesach needs all those things is because it changes its status, right? You take a Pesach and if Pesach is over, that animal becomes a shlamim. Once it's a shlamim, you have to treat it like everything else you would do for a shlamim, which includes smicha and tnufat chazev v'shok, etc. But that doesn't mean because a second thing requires more things, because it's a different status. So that is sort of the answer to this question of how do you ever think? That's why we asked the question yesterday that a second order thing would never be more chamer than a primary. And if you learn out chatat from Ola, you can't say that there's rules by chatat that are stricter than what you have from Ola, which is the primary source. Says the Gemara, though, Ibaitema, a whole nother answer today, which is to answer the question we had yesterday of how do you know that if you do a karban ola in the north, not in the north, right? Karban ola has to be shechted in the tzafon. If you don't do it, how do you know that it's bad, that's ma'akev? Not from a kal v'chomer, from chatat, because Amar Kra ha-ola, there's an extra hey. Torah says ha-ola, and it already said that, already said ola earlier. Why does it tell you that? B'mekoma tehei. It has to, it's repeating it to say it's supposed to be in the north. It has to be in the north. And if it's not done, it is ma'akev. So that is how we know Ola, either from this pasuk or as we said yesterday, from the Kal V'chomer and from the other sources we talked about yesterday. So that is Ola. And now says the Gemara, Asham, right? The next carbon, which the Mishnah said in carbon Asham, trying to see where I am. We are, how do you put this? Around 12 lines from the top, the middle of the line, the word Asham. How do you know that a carbon Asham, minaland bait safon? So we proved yesterday, Chata, we proved Ola, which is where it says it by an Ola. How do you know that a carbon Asham needs to be in the north? Says the Gemara, because the pasuk says in Tzav, b'makom asher yishchatu et Ola, yishchatu et Asham. Torah very explicitly says it. Where you shech the Ola, which is the north, you should shech the Asham. Okay, that's shchita. Ashkechan shchita, you see that you have to shech in the north. Kabbalah minalan, how do you know that you have to accept the blood in the north? Maybe you could be standing in the south and do that. That's because it says et damo yizrok, that you should be able to sprinkle the blood, meaning that you could be zorik the dam immediately. So therefore, the blood has to be accepted. Kibel damo nami b'tzafon. It has to be done, the Kabbalah, even in the north. Says the Gemara, okay, that's that the blood has to be in the north. But how do you know mikabel atzmo minalan? Maybe you could stand in the south, reach over the jar, accept the blood in the north, but how do you know that the person has to be standing in the north? Therefore, it says damo ve'et damo. It says both the words damo, and there's an extra ve'et. The ve'et tells you also the person who's accepting the blood. Okay, so that's how we know shchita and Kabbalah has to be done in the north. Okay, remember Zrika obviously is not necessarily because it's done all around the Mizbeach, but shchita and Kabbalah. Says the Gemara, as we always say, that's telling you you're supposed to do it. Ashkechan mitzvah. Okay, so that tells you you're supposed to do it that way. How do you know that if you don't do it that way, it's puzzle? Lakev minalan. They're now more than halfway down, like in the middle of the line. How do you know I have a vav by mine? How do you know ma'akev that it's ma'akev? So that's why, because there's another pasuk, krach v'inaktiv. There's another pasuk that repeats this, which says b'shachat et hakeves, and it continues b'makom asher shachat et hachatat ve'et ha'olah. I said it backward. Et hachat ve'et ha'olah, right? You should shech the keves where you shech the chatat and the olah, and this is extra, and it's telling you that if you don't do it, it's ma'akev. Says Gemara, is that true? Is that what you do with this pasuk? We use this pasuk for something else. We actually use this pasuk for a very elaborate braita, which we're going to read some of now. And the braita here goes through some of the rules. Right? Remember, we always talk about the halachot, the dvarim, the drachim that the Torah is nidreshet. So one of the rules of the Torah is the Keditanya, davar shaya bichlal. Something was included in the general category. We said everything is in the north, let's say. And then one thing is excluded, yatsa lidon b'davar chadash. We'll see, these are abstract ideas, but we're going to see them concrete in a minute. That thing is then taken out to tell a new halacha. So we say item B has a new halacha. Says the Braita, iyata rashai lachsiro leklalo. You cannot say, oh, for everything else, it goes back into the klal. Because once the Torah said that this is different for one new thing, you cannot put it back in the klal Ad shiachzirenu hakatuv lichlalo beferush. Until the Torah says explicitly, put this back into the category. Now, what are we talking about? It sounds very abstract. It's Ketzat, says the Braita. The pasuk says the following. It says, and this is the pasuk we just quoted in Shmini. V'shachat et hakeves. You should shech the lamb. Keves is a sheep. Shech the sheep. Shecht the sheep. V'makom asher yishchat et hachatat ve'et olah. Right? Shechted in the place where you shechted the chatat and the olah, which is the north, as we now know. Bin mekom hakodesh. Again, we don't know what all this is for. You shechted in the holy place. Ki kechatat ha'ashamu. Because the asham that we're talking about is like a karban chatat. Well, it seems very repetitive. It says shech the animal like the chatat and the asham and the olah, because the asham is like the chatat. Says the Braita, it seems very repetitive at the end to say that you treat the asham like a chatat, right? So, or like the chatat is treated the asham, right? Why does it say that? And the reason it says that is because sometimes the asham is treated very differently. Says the Braita, yatsa asham mitzora lidom b'davar chadash. There's a special asham of a mitzora, a person who's has tzarat. When they become tahar, they bring a karban asham. And that has a very unusual halachot because bibo and yad, bo and regel, vos and yamanit. Like unlike every karban chatat, and every karban olah, you take the blood from that asham and you put it on the finger, the big thumb, we call it, though it's not the biggest finger, the thumb, and the big toe, and the right ear of the mitzorah. So now that's a very novel thing. So you might have thought, wait, asham mitzorah has its own rules. It's different than every other karban. And once it's told that we do something unique about it, maybe don't even put it on the mizbeach. Maybe unlike so remember, every karban is put on the mizbeach, the blood and the parts. But this asham mitzorah, Torah said something very unique about it, that it's done, put the blood on the ear and the finger. Maybe you don't burn it on the mizbeach. Therefore, the Torah has to come and put it back into the klal. It was taken out of the klal of all karbanot. Talmud Omar, kir chatat ha'asham. The asham is like a chatat, right? Like the chatat, you treat the asham. Ma chatat ta'una matan damim ve'imon legab mizbeach. Just like a chatat needs to have the parts and the blood put on the mizbeach, af asham mitzorah, so too the asham mitzorah ta'un matan damim ve'imon legab mizbeach. Okay, so that's why the Torah says kichatat ha'asham. It says the Gemara, okay, thank you very much. But you just tried to use this pasuk to prove that a karban asham has to be done in the north because it's treated like a chatat. But we need this pasuk to tell you that a karban asham is treated, that's to be burned on the mizbeach, that has to have blood. So how do you know the north? So that's why, because if it wasn't telling you the north, in Cain, nichtav rachman b'hai, v'lo nichtav b'hai. You know what the Torah could have said if it wasn't required for it to be done in the north, right, then the Torah could have said nichtav b'hai, meaning it could have written that you have to shecht it in the north only in the context of the asham mitzorah, right, and not talking about every other asham. Lo nichtav b'hai. from the fact that it wasn't, this pasuk is not talking about a mitzvah, right? This pasuk in Shmini, sorry, is talking about every single asham. So therefore, since it didn't say it specifically by a mitzvah, it's telling you an extra halacha and telling you basically that not only can we learn a lot about a mitzvah, about asham mitzvah, but that the asham has to be done in the north, and if it's not done, it's ma'akev. Says the Gemara, okay, but that only makes sense, honey. We are 2 lines from the bottom. Isviralan yatzalidom davar hachadash. That the rule is that if you have a thing, in this case, asham mitzora, which is excluded from the rule to give you a new rule, in this case, that you put blood on the ears, that means that it can no longer be compared to the general rule of karbanot. Aval, turn the daf to daf mem tet amabet. Aval klalo gamar mina. But still, the other things can be learned from it, right? Then shaper. That's good, right? Meaning, if the Torah says karbanot are one category, you then say asham mitzvah is its own thing because it has very unique application of blood on a person's fingers and ear. So that tells me, according to one Manda Amar, the asham mitzvah is its own status. You can no longer compare the asham mitzvah to all the other karbanot, unless the Torah comes back and says compare it, which it does. But that you can still compare the other things from the asham mitzvah. So then it makes sense, right? Because then it could have said the halacha by Asham Mitzora that you have to be in the north. And then it could have said, oh, it's a special halacha, a special karban, but I would still learn out all the other karbanot from the Asham Mitzora. Ela isvir lamad, if you're of the opinion, which is another opinion in the Tanaim, de lo hu gamar mechlolov lo klalo gamar minei, that if something like an Asham Mitzora is excluded from the general rule, nothing that it says by Asham Mitzora can be taught from there onto Shar Karbanot and not from Shar Karbanot onto it, then Haile Gufeinstrich. Then you need to say that the Asham Mitzora is treated, needs to be burnt, shechted in the north. Because if you didn't tell me that, I couldn't learn out other things from it, right? So you need both sources. Says Gemara, you're right. That is a problem. But the truth is that kiva da hadre ahadre, that once the Torah said Asham Mitzvah is put back into the category of regular karbanot, right? Because remember, Asham Mitzvah is taken out because it has special halachot of putting the blood on the ear and the finger. But then the Torah says kichatat ha'asham, tells you that it puts back the chatat and the asham are similar, meaning the Asham Mitzvah is like all other karbanot. And therefore, when the Torah tells you that, right, it no longer needs to tell you that you shecht an Asham Mitzvah in the north or any Asham in the north. Why does it need to tell you that? Because an asham is now in the category of regular karbanot, like a chatat. Why does the Torah say it again? It's extra, and it's telling you it's ma'akev, that not only is it supposed to be shechted in the north like a chatat or like an olah, but that it's supposed to be, and if you don't do it, it's puzzle. Says the Gemara, really, Mar Zutra Beiderav, Mari Ravina, says Mar Zutra, 4 lines from the top, Braiderav Mari to Ravina. How do you know that? Ema, maybe kiahadre kra, maybe when the Torah says put the asham back into the category of the other karbanot, it doesn't mean put it into everything. Maybe it only means the gabi matan damim ve'emuri. Maybe it's saying put the asham mitzora or all asham into the category of a chatat in regards to the fact that it needs to have blood sprinkled on the mizbeach or parts burned on the mizbeach. Why are those special? D'bai kahuna, because those need a kohen. Of a shchita, but remember that actually shechting the animal, the lo by kahuna, maybe lo by tzafon. Maybe you don't need tzafon. Maybe all the Torah is saying is that treat an asham like a chatat for the things that need a kohen, which is burning the parts on the mizbeach, sprinkling the blood. But maybe for things that don't need a kohen, you don't treat the asham like a chatat, and you don't need north. Im Cain, he answered him, probably Ravina answered him, name Makra, the pasuk could have just said, ki kechatat hu. It could have just said, it is like a chatat, right? Which tells you it's taken out of the category. Right? Sorry about that. It's taken out of the category of other karbanot, put it back in and treat it like a chatat. Maiki chatat ha'asham. Why do you say the word ha'asham, which is not necessary to telling you not only is it treated like a chatat, but it's kishar ashamot yiyah. It's treated like all other ashamot, and therefore, just like other ashamot, which are not an asham mitzora, so they're not ever excluded because they don't have blood on the finger and things like that. Therefore, you treat this asham like every other asham, and just like other ashamot are like a chatat and need to have shechted in the north, this one also needs to be shechted in the north. Says the Gemara, okay, that's great. But if you go back to the beginning of the pasuk said, I quote it here, sorry, I've got my Gemara in front of me. It said, I'm reading the whole pasuk, shachat et hakeves, makom asher yishchat et hachatat, ve'et ha'olah. Shechted where you shechted the chatas and the olah. Now the chatas is in the north, the olah is in the north. Why do you have to say both, right? They're in the same place. So says the Gemara now today, where my lamali lakshay lechatat, lami lakshay laolah. Why do we have to compare the asham to a chatat and to an olah? They're both the same thing. They're both burnt in the north. So why are you telling me that an asham is like a chatat or shechted in makom asher yishchalet chatat, makom asher yishchalet olah, right? Says Ravina Itzrach. We've discussed this a little bit before. Says Ravina, in fact, this pasuk is really, really influential in understanding how to darshan psukim. Because akshe the chatat, right? If let's say the Torah just said, treat an asham, shecht an asham in the place where you shechted the chatas, right? And didn't say, and where you shechted the olah. Well, akshe la olah, didn't say the olah. Hava mina, I would have thought, wait a second. How do we know about the chatas, right? Chatas mehechal namda. We only know that carbon chatas is shechted in the north because it says it by olah, and yesterday we compared the chatas to the olah. So chatas mehechal namda me'olah. You only learn a carbon chatat from a carbon olah. And now it seems like if it's true that you can learn from a chatat to an asham, you might have thought, oh, you can learn from an olah to a chatat, A to B, and then B to C. But that would mean that davar halamed behekesh, a chatat which is learned from a hekesh from olah, can be chozer malamed behekesh. It can then pass that on through another hekesh, and we know that's not true. So therefore, the Torah had to say, shecht it in the place you shecht the olah, because the olah is the primary source of north, and we're comparing the asham to the olah. Says Gemara, well, then why does it say chatas at all? Amalei Marzutra Breder of Murray, Derav Murray Liravina. Then Marzutra Breder of Murray to Ravina. So nikshe olah. So compare it to an olah, meaning say shech the asham where you shech the olah. V'lo nikshe lechatas. Don't mention the carbon chatat. What is it adding? Says Gemara, well, one second. If you hadn't said the karban chatat, havamin, I would have thought, oh, maybe in fact, davar halamad behekesh, chozer melamed behekesh. In fact, maybe you can do this principle. You can learn out B from A and then C from B, right? If that was true, akushi chatat, then why didn't the Torah just say the karban chatat? Nichalei, I would have said the reason the Torah did not say to shech the asham where you shech the chatat is it's better to makishle the ikar v'lo nakishle the tafel. Right? Since the primary source is a karban olah and the secondary source is a chatat, it's better to compare it to a primary source. But it doesn't prove to you that had it compared it to a chatas, that wouldn't have been enough. And therefore, lahachi akshe the chatat, akshe olah. Therefore, the Torah is actually teaching you this principle. It's saying, shech the asham where you shech the chatat. Wait a second. You can't learn that because you're not allowed to. Chatas is learned from a hekesh, and you can't learn one thing from a hekesh into another thing. So therefore, you can't just stop at chatat. Therefore, the Torah said also olah, akshe olah, and also compared it to an olah, l'meimar, to tell you, davar halamed behekesh, eino chozer umalamed behekesh. That if you learn one thing from a comparison, from a hekesh, you cannot then go and teach from that thing to the next thing. And we've discussed this last week. We've discussed this many times already, that many things in Kachim, you learn B from A, you cannot then learn C from B for that thing through a hekesh. Maybe you can through a kal v'chomer or a gzeir shava, but not through a hekesh. And we're going to keep discussing this. That's the first answer. Rava Amar, where am I? Sorry, I lost my place here. Rav Amar, yeah, here we are. So I guess around 20 lines from the top, somewhere close to the middle word on a line, Rava said, Mehacha, I've got another source to tell you that a davar halamed mihekesh cannot be learned into another hekesh, right? Eino chozer malamed behekesh. And that's based on the pasuk which says the following. And this pasuk is referring to a karban chatat. right? So the pasuk says, sorry, this pasuk is referring to the par of the Kohen Mashiach, right? Remember that first pasuk, first parsha, way back in Vayikra, a Kohen Mashiach does a sin. He has to bring a par. He has to burn it. Remember, the Torah went through. You burn all the parts, the yotar takaved, the shtei klayot, and then it said, "Ka'asher yuram mishar zevach hashlamim," just like the parts that were burnt, that were taken from the shlamim. Now, it says Rava, and this is a very important drasha. What are we comparing the par to the shlamim for? If it's there to tell you that just like by a shlamim you have to burn the fats on the mizbeach, the Torah says it by the par, right? It says it by the par Kohen Mashiach. Remember, it doesn't say it by the par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, which is the next parsha. And we talked about this before, that the par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor is learned out from the par Kohen Mashiach, and then teaches the Sa'ir Avodah Zarah. But says Rava, so why does it say that? Mishum, the reason it says it is the boy agmuri yoter tagavedu shtei klayot mi par helam davar shel tzibor l'si'iri avodah zarah. We learned this last week. We have to then go again. Item A is par kohen Mashiach. Item B is par helam davar shel tzibor. By A, it says burn the fats. By B, it does not say burn the fats. It just uses the word par. By C, which is Sa'ir Avodah Zarah, it doesn't say anything, and we learned that out from B. So since you're going to learn from B to C, but B is only learned from A, that's a problem. So let me read that inside. We want to learn. Which I'm calling B, Lis Irei Avodah Zarah. Right? We want to learn from B to C. But however, it doesn't say it, right? It doesn't say to burn the fats by B, which is Par Halam Davar Shel Tzibor. Par Kohen Mashiach Hu Degamer. We only learned it out from Par Kohen Mashiach. So it says it by A. We learned B from A, but then how can you learn C from B? Therefore, the Torah has to say an extra pasuk. L'hachi Yisrach, there needs to be an extra pasuk. Had there not been an extra pasuk, you would not have been able to learn out C from B, since B was learned from A, which means Davar Halamed Behekish, Eino Choser Melamed Behekish. And therefore, therefore, Itzrach, the Torah had to say extra words, Kasher Yuram, Mishar Zevach Hashlamim, do it like you did the Shlamim, to say it's an extra pasuk as if it's written by B. So even though we learned B, Parham Davar Shel Tzibor from A, it's as if it's written explicitly by B. And therefore, you don't have the limitation that it's only learned by Hekesh and it can't teach another Hekesh. So that is why there's an extra pasuk by the Par Kohen Mashiach. Amalei Rav Papa L'Rav, instead of Papa L'Rav, it sounds like you're going backwards to scratch your head. Why did the Torah just say it by Par Halam Davar Shel Tzibor? Why does it say it by Par Kohen Mashiach, teach Par Halam Davar Shel Tzibor, and have an extra pasuk tell me it's as if it's written explicitly? Just write it. Below Nakish, you don't need to have a Hekish. Says the Gemara, again, you wouldn't have learned the whole principle. Because the Katav Bigufei V'lo Akish, if it just said, burn the fats by B, which is Par Halam Davar Shel Tzibor, Hava Amin, I would have thought, I don't know. It does. How do I know that you can't learn out C from B if B is learned from A? Hava Amin, Davar Lamed Behekish Choser Melamed Behekish. And in fact, you could learn out C, Sa'ir Avodah Zarah, from B if B was learned from A. So if that's the case, don't write it at all. It's better to write it than to make a hekesh. You can't, Torah very often writes things that are unnecessary, right? You can't say, why did the Torah write it? Torah writes it. Therefore, the Torah goes to this crazy format where it writes it by Par Kohen Mashiach. And then you make a hekesh to Par Halam Davar Shel Tzibor, but you say that's not enough. You have to have an extra pasuk lemeimer to tell you Davar Halamed Behekesh Ein Choser Melamed Behekesh. Something which started off from a hekesh cannot go and teach another thing, because unless of course there's an extra pasuk. Says the Gemara. Let's just review this, okay? We are, at the 2 dots, which is the 4th from the last narrow lines. Davar Halamat Behekesh, an item that was learned from a hekesh from another source. In this case, it's a great case. Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor is learned from Par Kohen Mashiach. Ein Choser Melamed Behekesh. You cannot then say something else is compared to Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor and has the same rule. Either Rava, we proved it from Rava earlier today, from it said by the Asham, or Miravina, or from the proof of Ravina. However, ask the Gemara, what about Gzeira Shava? What about Davar Lamed Behekish? Ma'ash Yilmad B'Gzeira Shava? Can you learn B from A, from a Hekish, and then if something is then compared to B through Gzeira Shava, is that strong enough for that thing to go onto that to that halacha to be taught forward? So Tashma, let's try to prove it. And we're going to, prove it from a very interesting case of Tzarad. Minatan ben Avtulas Omer, last narrow line. Remember, minayin the pricha bebegadim shi Torah. Remember, there's halacha by tzarad, a very unusual halacha that if you break out in tzarad, you're tamei. But if it covers your entire body, then you're not tamei anymore. How do we know that's true also by clothing, right? If you get a spot on clothing that's tzarad, it's tamei. But if it covers the entire beged, it becomes tahar. Doesn't say that. How do you know that? Says Natan ben Avtulas. Nemar karachat v'gabachat bebegadim. It uses the words karachat and gabachat, which usually means a bald head and a bald forehead, by clothing, which is weird, right? And it says the same thing by a person, okay? Just like malahalan, just like by a person, parach bekulot tahar, if the tzarat spread over the whole person, that person becomes tahar. Afkan parach bekulot tahar. So, again, this is Gzeira Shava because it's from a word in one place that's in another place, okay? Says more, but how do you know it by a person? How do we know it by a person? Now we know it by a person. How do you know it by a person's head? I mean their hair. It says from his head to his feet. The itgash rosho l'raglav, and we have a hekesh from the head to the feet, meaning from the head to the rest of the body, right? Ma'alahalan, just like by the feet, the Torah says, or on the body, kulo hafach lavan parach bekulo tahar, that if the entire body becomes white, it's tahar. Afkan, so too, we learn by the head, kulo hafach lavan parach bekulo tahar, that if the whole thing turns white, it becomes tahar. So basically, we're doing a hekesh, right? We're learning a gzeira shava and a hekesh, and you see that although we know the head is tahar from the body, which is a hekesh, we can then take a gzeira shava and compare the head of a human to the clothing of a human. So you see that davar halamad may hekesh kemichozer umalamed b'gzeira shava. So that is the proof. Says Rabbi Yochanan, not a good proof. You know how I know it's not a good proof? Where am I? 5 lines from the bottom, Rabbi Yochanan, not a good proof. Because that is not referring to kachim. It's referring to tzarat. Everyone agrees that b'chol Torah kula made him laman melamed. Of course, in the rest of the Torah, you can learn out one thing from another thing to another thing. It's the kachim that the problem is. Chutz min hakachim, shein danin lamed milamed. In kachim, you can't go and learn one thing to A to B and then B to C. Dim came because if that was the case, that you can learn one thing to the next, why don't you say lo yamer tzafona b'asham? Why don't we forget about the whole Gemara from today? Never tell me that an asham needs to be done in the north. Why, and how am I going to know? Take the Gzeira Shava. I learned it out from the Gzeira Shava of Kachi Kachim Mechatat. It says the word Kachi Kadashim by Chatas, and we know Chatas is in the north because it's a Hekish from Ola. It says Kachi Kachim by Asham. If you said that the Hekish can then lead to a Gzeira Shava, why do you need to ever say that an Asham is in the north? Lav Lamemer must be to teach you the Davar Halamad Behekish like a Karban Chatat. Ein chozer melamed b'gzeira shava. I can't teach an asham even through a gzeira shava. Says, well, not necessarily, because maybe this is not a good gzeira shava. Dilma mishum ikal mifrach. Maybe you can get rid of this gzeira shava by saying, well, chatas is very strict. Malach chatat shki mechaper de chayvei kritot. Right? A carbon chatat is mechaper on a sin that's a karet. Remember that an asham is not necessarily a sin that's a karet. You can do asham ami'ila, you do asham shifcha charufa. These are not things that are karet. So maybe a chatat has to be done in the north because it's very strict, but an asham doesn't. It says, Mark, you're right. But kanchi kadashim yeter TV. But it says kanchi kadashim extra. And if it says things that are extra, that usually means that it's a gzeira shava mufna, right? It's an extra gzeira shava, in which case the fact that there's a pircha doesn't affect it. So in fact, it should be, so Rashi says, it's a gzeira shava that's mufna mishnei tzadim, meaning it's extra on both sides. It's extra on the chata side, it's extra on the asham side. And if that's the case, you can't ask the question on that gzeira shava. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan ends today, this is where we're going to end today, Sunday's daf, that in fact, you cannot learn something from a gzeira shava if you previously learned it out from a hekesh. And the proof is that otherwise you would not need to say that an asham is done in the north, because I would have compared an asham to a carbon chatas. A chatas is learned out from an ola, And if you felt that you can do one to the other, then you wouldn't need to write it. The fact that you need to write it means that you cannot learn a lamad from lamad in kachim, and that's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Tomorrow, we're going to get to the next case, which we've discussed before, which is a kal v'chomer, but I'm going to leave it there and wish you all Shavua Tov. I hope this was clear, and I look forward to seeing you all shortly. Thank you.